together with military marches and national anthems. Some, sadly, now are obsolete. Tonight is the first in a new series of lectures held by the John Adams Institute called American Focus. Unlike a literary series, this new series will focus on politics, arts, economics, travel, etc. So, tonight, politics. Mr. Arnett, welcome. We are honored that you agreed to come to Amsterdam and speak to our audience. We were relieved when we heard that you had arrived safely at Schiphol Airport this morning, coming from South Africa. The Dutch edition of Mr. Arnett's autobiographical book recently appeared in translation with publishing house Balans. In a few minutes, the publisher, Mr. Geert Gaarland, will present the Dutch edition to Mr. Arnett. The evening will then continue with an introduction by Raymond van den Boogaard, reporter for NRC Handelsblad. This will be followed by Mr. Arnett's speech or reading. There will be a short intermission around 9 o'clock, during which Mr. Arnett will sign books seated here at the podium. After the intermission, the program will continue with the questions and answers segment. The audience is kindly invited to actively participate in this second half of the program. One more remark. Smoking is not permitted in this auditorium. Only the people on the podium are allowed to smoke. Mr. Gaarland and Mr. Arnett, may I invite you to come to the podium, and ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your evening.
Peter Arnett, it was just after the Gulf War had ended that a rumor spread around that you were going to write your life story. That very spring, we happened to be in New York, that spring in 1991, and found out that Lynn Nesbitt was your literary agent. Lynn was also the one who sold us the Dutch rights of the books of Robert Hughes, and we know her well. We were able to make her a quick offer for the rights of your book to be. And it was Simon & Schuster who would publish you in the United States. The same time, we bought the rights of Bob Woodward's The Commanders to publish in a Dutch translation. That's to tell you a little bit the setting when we bought the rights of your unseen manuscript. As far as we are concerned, there was no need for hesitation to buy that unseen manuscript. We knew for sure that you were going to give us a terrific story. And indeed, when finally your manuscript came in, you had not disappointed us. We had it quickly translated by Jaap van der Wijk, who is here in the audience tonight and who did a wonderful job. Neither have you disappointed, I know, your American audience, considering the rave reviews the book has received all over the country. We may hope and expect that it will work the same way here in Holland in the coming days and weeks. Let me just quote a little piece from The New Yorker, which characterizes your book very well. It says, Arnett's memoirs are absorbing. He shows us how his approach to reporting, which is keep looking and write exactly what you see, evolves into a commitment to tell the truth because the public deserves accurate information. This simple credo has made him a first-rate journalist. And last week, our own NRC Handelsblad wrote about your book. It's the compelling story of a passionate war correspondent. Peter, we are very proud to have a first-rate journalist and a passionate writer on our list of authors. On behalf of Bijlans, I now want to hand you the first copy of the Dutch edition, and thank you very much for coming all the way to Holland to help the book reach the big audience it deserves.
Ladies and gentlemen, to actually risk one's life in order to go there and see for yourself what is happening. That is what the life of a war reporter comes down to. Peter Arnett is such a reporter and has been for most of his working life. From battlefields in Vietnam, where he reported for the Associated Press, up to the city of Baghdad, while it was being battered by the tomahawks of the United States, and we, the viewers of CNN, for a whole memorable night were glued to our TV sets to hear Arnett describe how it was to witness all this from a hotel room. In his autobiography, Live from the Battlefield, which we will discuss tonight, Arnett describes how sometimes in his career his bosses wanted to make him do different things, like describing peaceful problems of healthcare in the US or some other more quiet assignment, because after all, nobody is supposed to like war all the time. That invariably, we learn from the book, led to an acute sense of frustration with the reporter. Time after time, we see Arnett looking for an opportunity to return to the battlefield, to any battlefield. Witnessing military exercises turns out not to be a satisfying substitute for the real thing. Another example of Arnett's longing for conflict is his experience as a Moscow correspondent. One of the few things in his book he thinks worth mentioning about those 2 years in Moscow is how he and his crew dealt with physical harassment by KGB officers while they tried to film Jewish demonstrations. Definitely, here is a man longing for conflict to describe. To be actually there and to report what you see, that seems a truth-seeking strategy that nobody could really argue about. Could there possibly be a more truthful account of what is really happening than that made by a witness? So shouldn't everybody be grateful that there are people like Arnett willing to risk their lives and go there? Alas, reality is far more complicated. In fact, a lot of argument has been going on about Arnett's reporting over the years. First of all, there have always been the authorities, both political and military, who were not so much interested in reports about what actually went on, as in creating certain images on how things were supposed to be. The American involvement in Vietnam went very wrong indeed, almost from the outset. Arnett and others who were there had strong doubts about the massive military involvement by the US that led to a lot of heroism and led to a lot of body bags returning to the States, but actually achieved very little in strategic terms. This message, contained as it was in factual reports for the Associated Press, raised a lot of eyebrows over the years. And still, so many years after the Vietnam War, one can still hear the opinion that the Vietnam War was not so much lost by the States on the actual battlefield, but that lack of support in the American and Western media, bad publicity, and therefore also lack of popular support fatally undermined the American war effort. About 20 years have passed since the end of the Vietnam War. The emphasis in war reporting has shifted from the written press to television, and so have the efforts of those who want to portray their war effort in a so-called responsible, that is, propagandistically advantageous way. But again, those who at the Pentagon briefings presented the war, the Gulf War in this case, as a more or less happy video game with so-called surgical airstrikes that allegedly left Iraqi civilians unharmed, found Arnett on their way. Not only did he witness and report the fact that there was plenty of destruction of civilian targets and destruction of civilians in Iraq, he also interviewed Saddam Hussein to see how he felt about it. Both breaches into the carefully constructed story of the surgical destruction of the evil warmonger were not appreciated by political and military decision makers. So the same anti-propaganda, if not outright slander, was heard again, that Arnett was a tool of the enemy, that the only thing wrong was that Arnett was Arnett seeing and reporting the wrong things. Live from the Battlefield, the book, is in part an apology. Arnett's argument is of a surprising simplicity. I have been there, I made the effort, I reported what I saw, whatever everybody else tried to make me see different things or to give a meaning to what I've seen that did not seem obvious to me. There was no reason to believe, for example, that the Baghdad milk plant that at the Pentagon briefings was turned into a chemical weapons factory was anything else but a milk plant. Although the principles of Arnett's reporting have not changed over the years, the medium for which he is working has. His reporting for Vietnam was in the best traditions of the American written press. Since then, he turned to television, and more exactly, Ted Turner's cable news network. It is suggested in the book that the change has not been an easy one for Arnett. You can't really convey your impressions on television unless you have concrete footage, images to go with it. It has become chic in recent years to be highly critical of television reporting, saying that TV is turning more and more into showbiz, with other people's misery and war being presented as stunning entertainment handily packed in half-hour slots. And that the medium, as McLuhan predicted many years ago, has indeed become the message, not the reality on the ground. This controversy is perhaps far more interesting than the one between real reporters and concerned officials we were talking about earlier, because the threat to truthful reporting seems to come from within the news business and therefore is perhaps far more threatening for the status and trustworthiness of reporters. Live from the Battlefield, the book, however, is not a philosophical treatise on the rights and wrongs of reporting or journalistic ethics. The book is a personal account of a kind of reporting that seems very remote from an evening of quiet discussion like this one is supposed to be. It is about the actual trade. It is about how to get to the place where things are actually happening and how to be there first, preferably leaving your competition behind. It is about how to get your story, to get it right, and to file it ahead of the competition. It is also about the grueling task of calculating your personal risk, because by far the worst reporter is a dead reporter. These are concerns far more present on the reporter's mind than any analytical, let alone philosophical consideration that might come up in the mind of the newspaper reader or the TV viewer. These practical considerations should not be underestimated, were it only for the fact that in every war, a number of reporters get killed or crippled for life. Still, there are people like Peter Arnett who feel they have to do this, or perhaps even like doing it. We will try and interview him about this and many other questions in the second half of the evening, when we will also be happy to take questions from the audience. In the first half, we will hear a lecture by Peter Arnett himself. Arnett's Vietnam reporting made him famous, if not with the readers of newspapers, who are well known for their short memories, then at least within the news business. Worldwide cable news network brought him worldwide fame, and no doubt Arnett is the most popular war reporter that ever set foot on earth. So, in more than one way, we are happy to have him with us tonight. Live, alive, and kicking, straight from the battlefield, ladies and gentlemen, Peter Arnett.
Thank you, Raymond. I just want you to keep on talking. You know, I don't need to say anything. And first of all, I want to thank Ballance for publishing my book here. It is a privilege. It's exciting to see it in the Dutch language. I did work for the Associated Press for 20 years, and I used to get newspaper clippings from all around the world in many languages, but now it's my own book in Dutch, and that is a thrill, because everyone has egos, including war reporters. We've got egos. Secondly, all you folk that are here tonight, I was under the impression Amsterdam was a swinging city. Isn't there anything else to do tonight but come and listen to me? tell you, if I wasn't here, I'd be out swinging with my fiancée, Kimberly. But we're here, and it's actually a great pleasure. And so many young people here. That is a thrill to me, because I feel that my career is just a part of a great tradition in Western journalism, that I am not an aberration. I didn't come out of little old New Zealand and create and carve new ground or tread new roads in journalism. My tradition goes back really to the mid-19th century, when the first British journalists covered the Crimean War, and then European reporters got into because in the middle of the 19th century, 5% of the people in the Western world could read. Later that century, when the readership got up to 90% in Britain and got very high in the United States and in Europe, newspapers emerged, and there were lots of war reporters like me. I want to thank Raymond again. He, of course, is himself a war correspondent, a couple of years in Bosnia, which has been the most dangerous news story. So when he's asking me questions later about motivation and why it's done, I'm going to throw a few back at him, because I know many journalists who say, we'll go anywhere except Sarajevo. And in fact, what was interesting about Sarajevo was that so few American journalists were willing to go there. The ones that did go there did, I think, a wonderful job. But I think that was a story where primarily the European press distinguished itself, with some notable American exceptions. So it's not just me that's infected with the virus. I did notice in the program that you would be introducing the evening with the music from Apocalypse Now, which I suppose is appropriate, because I did spend 10 years in Vietnam. To some degree, my worldwide notoriety is a burden. When I arrived in Johannesburg, the customs officer said, "By God, is NATO going to start bombing our city if the elections don't turn out well?" And when CNN tried to get me into North Korea recently to interview Kim Il-sung, the ambassador at the UN was shocked. He said, "Peter Arnett, wherever he goes, doom follows." They let Mike Chinoy, a relatively peaceful reporter from our Peking bureau, to go and interview Kim Il-sung. So it is somewhat of a burden. On the other hand, I am lucky. I arrived on a KLM flight this morning at 7:30 this morning, 7 o'clock this morning. I got on it 24 hours ago, actually. The arriving flight that we passed in the air arrived as a bomb was going off at Johannesburg airport, a car bomb. And I believe the KLM officers were damaged to some degree, but I hope that none of the personnel were hurt. I haven't heard the full details. I haven't had a chance to tune into CNN, which is the source of all information, as we all know. But I'll just mention South Africa. We have made a commitment to South Africa. We have 66 personnel and so staff we've sent down there to join our regular Johannesburg bureau. We've established live bureaus in Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg. We've got our prime anchor, Bernard Shaw, there. I was there one whole month covering what I thought was a wonderful story, a story about emerging democracy, peace, reconciliation, change. As it turned out, I was back, of course, in the trenches, in a sense. A photographer from the Johannesburg Star, whom I knew, was killed Monday of last week, and two other photographers, one of whom I knew was seriously injured in one of the East Rand townships, a black township where there was factional fighting between the Zulus and ANC supporters, Nelson Mandela's party. So even though I went to cover a story of peace, I ended up, hugging the dirt in Thokoza and, watching colleagues die and get wounded. Just on Sunday of this week, and on Monday, just a couple of days ago, I was in Johannesburg. I rushed to the sites of 2 car bomb explosions. The first in the center of Johannesburg near the headquarters of Nelson Mandela's party, wounded 103 people, killed 9. And when I got there, the bodies and blood were everywhere. Yes, the next morning, 2 days ago, at Germiston, a community that I'd visited a couple of times in the course of other stories, another car bomb killed 10 black workers and shoppers and wounded 40 or 50. So I don't necessarily search for war. In fact, my career, even though the book is Raymond, and it was a superb analysis, Raymond, and I have some remarks prepared, and I think I'll throw them all away to respond to some of the points you made. But I was not born a war reporter. I think my book shows that I sort of grew up just a normal life in little old New Zealand. I was bored being in that little island. I mean, after all, even Abel Tasman visited it only for 3 days and left in 1642 and never did go back. That's why it was never a Dutch territory. It was just too far away, even for Tasman. And I had my youth there and did leave. I had no intentions of becoming a war correspondent. I went to Australia, Southeast Asia. It was exciting to be there. My early reporting was on politics, and my first reporting with the Associated Press was on social changes, political changes, economics. Then I arrived in Vietnam, and war reporting happened around me. And it was less the excitement of the guns firing that attracted me first to war. It was, I guess, the controversy of the reporting. Because I assure you, when guns go off, I hit the dirt. I get very nervous around weapons, which makes it my life in the United States hell, because everyone, of course, in America has a gun, and often insists on showing you it. And well, it's not that bad, but a lot do. But so what did interest me, and what interested me about war reporting, that I realized in Vietnam that it was a fault line. Wherever a government commits its forces to action, there's immediate controversy. The fact of committing troops to war is basically immoral. I mean, when was the last just war? I mean, the last just war, World War II, maybe the first just war, the only just war. But even within World War II, there were excesses of violence. Bad decision-making, the carpet bombing of Dresden, other cities. This doesn't mean to say that the fascist enemy was just as brutal, probably much more so, we know that. But does that excuse our brutality? The fact that the other guy's doing it, why don't we do what he's doing? And in Vietnam, that was an early controversy. There was Viet Cong terrorism in the first, it was called terrorism. The Viet Cong insisted it was just political actions in reaction to government policies. Our reporting of some of the excesses in the early years rang bells in the White House and in the Pentagon. They started criticizing, not just me, but David Halbertson, a brilliant young reporter my age in those days, Neil Sheehan, who was with UPI, and others, Stanley Kano, a brilliant young reporter for Time magazine, all who have since emerged as important journalists in America. What we reported about that war was contrary to what the US government, what the US mission, in fact, what Western governments wanted to think about it. My own country, New Zealand, the ambassador there, and other newspaper publishers who would visit would chastise me for not getting behind the war effort. Get on the team, they would say. And this was echoed in the American media. Well, what it was then is that when I realized that the controversy of my writing, the fact that it would bring reaction from the Home Office was exciting to me, that I was actually digging into an issue that was controversial, much more interesting than getting shot at. You go out and you get shot at. In fact, I want to read here the one piece from the book I'll read. I want to read about what the bureau chief at those years, Malcolm Brown, who was the Saigon bureau chief of the AP, a man my age, who had been educated at Brown University in the States, had been to Cuba at a young age during the Revolutionary War that Fidel Castro fought. He had prepared a pamphlet, and I was the newest AP man to arrive, and he gave me this pamphlet, and this is what I was reading on my first helicopter trip out of Saigon. Let me read it to you. It was called Some Pointers of Guerrilla Warfare, and Mel wrote, "At times you will find yourself in combat situations, and you should react to them like a soldier by doing everything you can to keep alive and unwounded. Try to keep in good physical condition so you can march or run for a reasonable distance. You might have to save your life doing this at some point. You should know how to swim. Canals and ditches often are above your head. If you hear a shot and think it's not from your own side, don't get up and look around to see where it came from. The second shot might get you. Lie prone under fire and move only on your belly. Look for cover and move towards it. When moving with troops, do not stay close to the head of a column or the point man in a formation. Professional soldiers are paid to do this. Do not stand or march next to the radio man or aid man, because they are prime targets of the enemy. Stick close to the commander, who is generally in the safest position available. And a good point, you'll learn more from him than from most of the others anyway. And he said the whole idea of covering an operation is to get the news and pictures back, not to play soldier yourself. And if anything has guided me in my years of covering wars, don't play soldier. I mentioned in my book at times when I was pressed into the service, some besieged units were in trouble. And the squad leader or something would say, Arnett, take this rifle. If we get attacked, we expect you to defend it, our position. And I grudgingly did, but always in my mind, I have not been the participant. I've always wanted to be the observer. Just a couple of other points Malcolm made. The joy of covering wars. When moving through enemy territory, and a good part of Vietnam is enemy territory, watch your feet. Spikes, mines, concealed pits, and booby traps are everywhere. When possible, step in exactly the same place as the soldier ahead of you. If he wasn't blown up, you probably won't be. If you get stuck in a mortar barrage or accidental airstrike from your own side, which happened, the best place is to be underground, climb into underground cellars and things. If you're traveling in an armored amphibious carrier, do not stick your head out of the hatch when the vehicle is under fire. The gunner has to because it's his job. Do not pick up Viet Cong flags or other souvenirs from haystacks, tree branches, or poles. They're often booby-trapped with grenades. And he said, beware of water buffalo. And of course, the farms and fields of Southeast Asia are covered with water buffalo. They're the local tractors. And he said, when water buffalo get excited, they stampede, charge, and kill, and Vietnamese forces had suffered a number of casualties. Mel said, don't be misled by seeing children playing in the backs of water buffalo. Children and buffalo are friends. And I mentioned here, I commented, I was delighted with Mel Brown's instructions. There was nothing about being brave. Just save your ass and get the story back. And that's what motivated me. Sure, by reading the book, you may get the impression, to say that I've covered 17 wars and that I was anxious to become part of war coverage, particularly the Gulf War. I felt frustrated sitting it out in Israel while my colleagues were being committed to one side or the other. But but my career, I feel I've specialized in international conflicts. I learned how to cover these conflicts in Vietnam, and since that time, I just have a passion to be where the commitment of troops has taken place, and particularly in this day and age after the Cold War, when we're not really clear about our own government's policies. We're not quite clear whether or not we should commit troops. There is uncertainty about the role of military forces. And in the Gulf War, the initial debate about the Gulf War in the United States, the Senate just barely passed an approval resolution to President Bush to go in there. Now, in the Gulf War, my preference was to go with Norman Schwarzkopf because I did know him in Vietnam. I have a chapter in my book about him as a major in 1965 in the Central Highlands. I had friends who were running into him in Saudi Arabia, and he kept saying, when's Peter Arnett coming? Because I'd known Schwarzkopf after he'd taken the command of the Horn of African Command. I had a dinner with him, and my fate was to be assigned to Saddam Hussein. And Schwarzkopf to this day is he's half convinced that I went to Baghdad deliberately just to infuriate him. But in fact, I didn't. I went to Baghdad because I was assigned there. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, what motivates me, and I think many other war correspondents, is the desire to cover the most challenging stories, because the most challenging stories have the greatest impact on our lives, and they do impact on everyday living of people. You know, in the United States, in Vietnam, 58,000 young Americans died. Many say needlessly. In Somalia, in just one day, 19 Rangers were killed on a mission that we're all very unclear about, and the reporting of that mission, of course, the pictures from Somalia altered and fundamentally changed American policy because of those pictures. And it seems to me that the world today it's more necessary to get for the press to play a role than ever before. And I've been interviewed several times today, and the role of the media has been brought up. You know, what is the media doing? You know, how influential is CNN? Should a media be so influential? And and it is influential, but what we're doing is so valuable in the world today. I'll give you an example. In South Africa, when I arrived a month ago, I was down in Cape Town and I covered the campaign of Alan Bosak. He's a very prominent former religious leader, a Baptist minister in the ANC party. He fell out of favor with some when he divorced his wife and married a young white woman 3 or 4 years ago. But he is running in the Cape for the prime ministership of the West Cape. He may lose the campaign. But I covered his campaign, and CNN is showing 10 hours every night in South Africa on one of the main channels. And he called me up a couple of days later and he says, my story on what he was doing was the first one to appear in South Africa because the government television hadn't bothered to cover his campaign. And so South Africans saw it first on CNN, which was sort of remarkable to me that we were CNN, a non-South African organization, essentially an international organization, did present to the people of South Africa aspects of their campaign. Right now, our live coverage constantly is also way ahead of the local media, interesting to me. You know, we've got a lot of correspondents, and we're impacting on the awareness of South Africa of what is happening. Of course, when you do that, you start getting criticism from those who feel that maybe you're going too far and in reporting that news. Now, I've got various aspects to talk about tonight, and we're going to have more question time, but I think the book is here. It speaks for itself. It's my career. It's my, essentially, the traditions that I followed when I was a kid in New Zealand. The name of Ernie Pyle, an American correspondent who covered Europe, followed American troops, was very well known. New Zealand papers carried his columns. He was the GI reporter, and he was killed in the Pacific after the European war had ended, and that really impacted on me because and later I met prominent journalists in Southeast Asia, and I became aware of the American tradition of journalism, and I started to learn about journalistic history, how the first British reporters went to the Crimean War. It was reports from the London Times in the 1850s that persuaded Florence Nightingale to take a team of nurses to the Crimean War and establish the first field hospital because the soldiers were dying of malnutrition and just weren't being treated. That reporting angered the British military authorities. They didn't want the press interfering, and that's where it started. I mean, the military authorities have been fighting us ever since. In the United States, the first reporting was by war reporting by an independent paper was in 1848, I believe, when a reporter from a Louisiana paper went into one of America's wars in Mexico. But since that time, there has been a great tradition of war coverage, and part of that commitment is to risk your lives in covering conflicts and wars. And I guess part of my motivation in continuing to be a war correspondent and wanting to get out where the story is, and I feel almost a compulsion to do it, is that I knew so many wonderful reporters in Vietnam and in other wars who gave their lives being journalists. There were 3 in the Associated Press, whom I write about in my book, who were killed in the field, believing that what they were doing was important. There were others in Central America. In the past 18 months, my former organization I worked for, the Associated Press, a great news institution, has lost 5 photographers killed. And this is the greatest number that they've lost in such a short of time in the whole history of the AP, and that's 140 years old, that great institution. And Horst Fass, the wonderful Vietnam photographer, a German-born photographer whom I write about a lot in my book, but who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and who is now running the AP new photo service out of London for the Middle East and Europe and Africa. He told me that the day when, at a time when 2 were killed in one day, that other photographers called up and volunteered to go to Somalia and also volunteered to go to Sarajevo. They wanted to replace these people who had died. That's how, excuse me, I'm overcome, but that is how strong the traditions are. And I think that, you know, Bosnia to me is an example. Now Raymond was there, but he didn't talk about Bosnia. But I had the opportunity to go there in February of this year for 3 weeks. I've been writing my book for a couple of years, and I didn't have an opportunity to go. And it was a revelation to me to see what the international media is doing over there. Now, Sarajevo, at the time I went, the situation was cooling down, and in fact NATO's ultimatum ceased the fighting there. But up to that point, just leaving your hotel, the Holiday Inn, the Holiday Inn there, it was like being on permanent point duty in a combat infantry company. The snipers were firing, there was shelling. And here were all these young reporters. I mean, the CNN operation there, I mean, it was totally unique to me. CNN had 2 armored vehicles that they had purchased for $110,000 each. And they would fit into the modern, you know, armored regiments, these vehicles. And not only CNN had them, but other news organizations. The CNN engineers sent 2 pages, or several closely typed pages of specifications to a firm in Belfast, Northern Ireland, to make these vehicles. You know, and in Belfast, they know how to make armored vehicles. So what was the specifications? A 3-ton vehicle, 4 tons when loaded. You could seat 6 people. You could carry a satellite phone, an edit pack for television, a generator, cameras. It was called a hardened car, as against the soft ones that don't have armor. They had a special laminate on the steel that the specifications provided that it would take 3 typical bullet hits, that's a 7.62 round, in the same place without cracking. So you can imagine 3 bullets in the same place on the side of the vehicle. The specifications were that they would not penetrate the vehicle. And one of the vehicles we had taken 6 hits, another a dozen, but never in the same place, so no one was hurt. And it was, in having vehicles like that, was really just managing the risk, because you did not remove the risk, because the Bosnian Serb at the checkpoints, I went through one day, and they have high-powered armor-piercing bullets and can just cut through these vehicles like butter if they want to use them. And we passed one Serb checkpoint, and one of the Serb guards sort of pulled his jacket aside and tapped at his ammo belt, where we could see his armor-piercing bullets, and he just went like that to us, you know, thinking, hey guys, I can get you anytime I want. And of course, but here was the risk that these young correspondents were taking. And so many are there, CNN and others, and I really felt, I think I was saying to an interviewer earlier, when I was in Sarajevo, I felt as though I'd been in Vietnam 30 years ago, when you had a great tradition of young people going out who believed the story was important, and they are passionate, the reporters there. They feel that there's been a terrible miscarriage of justice by the Western world, that we have not done enough. They feel the Serbs are brutal, that is well shown, and they feel committed to covering the Sarajevo side. So in that sense, I felt camaraderie with those young people. Some had read the book and liked it, so I felt good about that. But it's a camaraderie. Now, when they get around to writing, when Christiane Amanpour, the CNN correspondent, wonderful young woman, gets to write her book at age 55 or something, The reviewers will probably say, this woman's crazy, you know. Why does she cover wars? But I hope she'll say what I say, that wars are important, that when wars are launched, they are essentially immoral, and we have to be reminded of what is happening on the battlefield. We have to remind governments, we have to remind citizens of what's happening out there. We mustn't lose our sense of morality or immorality. Getting to CNN a little, and the organization I represent, and it's not only CNN, it's 12, 13 years of age. It's not only CNN anymore, it's the BBC. They have an international news operation, Sky News. We have the beginnings today of the internationalization of news. And reporting from a nationalist or patriotic standpoint is basically now out of date. During the Vietnam War, for example, I was often asked, as I mentioned earlier, you got to get on the team. How can you write stories critical of America? And in the Gulf War, and there was a lot of criticism about me because the interview with Saddam Hussein was deemed to be against the interests of the United States, as if Saddam Hussein in an interview could sort of melt Western resolve, because it didn't. But beyond those two controversies, it's become routine for CNN and other journalists to cover both sides. When the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982 and surrounded western Beirut, I covered that story. In the morning, I'd talk to Yasser Arafat at his headquarters, and he'd be in a sandbag bunker, and there'd be shells hitting him. Then I'd go up and interview General Sharon, and the Israel commander on the other side. And he'd say, did we get the son of a bitch yet? And I'd say, no. But then next morning I'd see Arafat, and he would say, have we got him yet? Because they were... But what I'm saying is that we were able to cross the lines, giving both sides. I mean, trying to give a balance. Because the Israelis argued they had a good reason to be in southern Lebanon. They wanted to get rid of the PLO. And of course, Yasser Arafat would tell us, wait a minute, we have a right to be here. Central America, again, when the U.S. was supporting the tin pot military dictatorships of Guatemala and El Salvador, we would cover our allies in the Salvadoran military during the one day, then we'd drive up next morning early and go to the FMLN guerrillas in the hills, the left-wingers, and get their viewpoints on what was going on. And as it is in Bosnia, because while I was being critical of the Bosnian Serbs, that doesn't mean to say we don't cover them. We do cover them. And we do have them on our air because there is both sides to the story. But what this means is that the concept of a journalist from an individual country essentially representing his country's interests are changing very rapidly. And our role goes beyond just informing our local citizens. It goes beyond even forming citizens in the Western world. For CNN, it essentially becomes an organization that's starting to fulfill a diplomatic role. I noticed in Bosnia when I was there in Sarajevo, when the deadline was approaching, the particular Sunday, for the NATO airstrikes to come in, if the Serbs had not pulled out, by noon that particular day, I think it was a Sunday, the Bosnian Muslims were giving interviews saying, the Serbs are reneging, we still have guns visible, NATO should bomb them. And then the Serbs were saying in interviews in Pali, now wait a minute, we're stuck in the snow, we're trying to get out, we're trying to comply. And it was only later that evening when President Clinton came on live, and he gave a live interview or a live press conference, in which he said, look, we are satisfied that there's probably been compliance, and the UN also got in. But I had the feeling that all of them wanted to be on CNN to at least talk to each other about this. I mean, how would President Clinton know what the Bosnian Serbs are thinking? There are no real diplomatic opportunities anymore. They don't have a U.S. mission sitting in Pali. They don't have coded communications equipment there. What you got is CNN. And you can have the Bosnians go on live and express themselves. In South Africa recently, when Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the Zulu leader, the chief of the Inkatha party, was arguing why he wanted to stay out of the election, he was on CNN every day. He was giving his point of view. We had Nelson Mandela and others. arguing the point of view. And in fact, today Buthelezi said on CNN, I noticed, that he wanted to pull out of the election because he felt that it was unfair, that his voters, the voting cards are inadequate, his people can't get enough voting, and here he is. Who are they talking about? And part of the reason for being on CNN is to explain to the United States and other interested embassies around the world that viewpoint, to an instant commentary. So if something does go wrong, and if Buthelezi does pull out of the election process, which could happen, then diplomats, businessmen, others around the world will be better informed. And that gives us a unique role in information, and a role that is being debated, that some are concerned about, and I think it does deserve debating. What we call the internationalization of information is news without borders. Okay, we borrowed from a famous medical organization, but it comes with a whole news organizational chart. So the fact that Ted Turner, an American, started CNN is incidental because we have an international staff now that by far the majority are non-Americans. They're French, British, German, Eastern Europeans, maybe even Dutch, and on our staff, probably have. And none of these individuals have any allegiance to the United States. Their allegiance is to accurate information. Their allegiance is to the truth as we see it. The allegiance is to getting information on the air. Now, there are some who believe, in fact, I was asked a question today about a media that is so much power, it's powerful, like CNN or the BBC, that we're driving government policies, that governments are being dragged along into international commitments that they may not want to be, that with reflection wouldn't be in these commitments. They wouldn't have to go and get involved in these commitments. But I would argue that if we do drive government policy, it's simply where government policy doesn't exist. And I'll give you an example of Somalia, where the U.S. did go in because there were media reports of famine amongst the Somalis a couple of years ago, and there was famine. But the U.S. knows how to handle famine. We fly in our surplus wheat. We've got medical flies. We're very good at helping in famines. We did it in Ethiopia. The added ingredient in Somalia was that the U.S. was talked into or persuaded to take a police role in what was going on. The U.S. public wasn't really told about that. Congress didn't vote on it. We were committed to a policing action, to a mini war without the American public knowing, without the world really knowing. What happened was the Somalis resented this, particularly the population of Mogadishu. They resented not only the American war, the American commitment to policing, but what others were doing. They killed quite a few Pakistanis on one occasion. Other nationalities were being killed, I think some Italians. And there were questions in America about U.S. policy, and President Clinton didn't seem to have a clue about how to change it. It was more of the same thing. And it wasn't until a Canadian reporter and a Somali cameraman happened to be at the scene where an American Ranger team got into action trying to attack Colonel Aidid's headquarters. He was a warlord of note at that time. Tried to attack his headquarters and were gunned down, losing 19 men. And the pictures that came out of there were frightening, particularly of dead Americans being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, being spat on, being kicked. And these pictures shocked the United States and pushed President Clinton into making a policy decision to get out of there. But this is a policy decision he had avoided making. He had avoided coming to terms with what was going on, and finally, we in the media showed him that Americans weren't popular in Mogadishu, Neither were the Pakistanis. They did not want us there. And what was the point of being in a country that we were not wanted? And again, just briefly in Sarajevo, there was no doubt that the video from the marketplace bombing 2 or 3 months ago now, I guess, when the shelling of a marketplace had the corpses of 68 innocent men, women, and kids going about their daily buying these miserable vegetables that were grown on the hillsides, and it inflated prices, and 68 were killed. And the video that we had from there CNN ran it constantly, and it pushed Clinton and other governments into taking action, pushing NATO in, and lifting the siege of Sarajevo. That siege is still being lifted. Sarajevo is still, it is functioning as normally as it could function, because why? We forced, the media forced by their presence, governments to take action. And I think that is in the most noble traditions of journalism. The London Times, convincing Florence Nightingale to help treat wounded soldiers in the Crimean War. I won't go on any longer. We'll have a question time afterwards. There's lots of other issues that I'd like to talk about, but we can reserve that for a little later. So thank you for all being here, and it's a pleasure to run into you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mr. Arnett. Thank you, Mr. van den Boogaard. There will be a short intermission of 20 minutes, so we have time enough for the second half of the program. Mr. Arnett will sign books seated here at the podium. See you in 20 minutes.
I've been told during the intermission that, in fact, this hall is bubbling with questions and criticisms to make. So feel free to interfere and ask those questions. There's a microphone here in the middle of the hall, but I think the acoustics are such that you might also stand up and ask your question, and if need be, we'll repeat it. I'd like to start off with a question myself, if you don't mind, Peter. In your book, you very convincingly describe that you are unhappy when you cannot cover a war. What is it exactly that makes you unhappy?
I'm unhappy when I cannot cover an important war. Right now, there's a war in Rwanda between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And the Tutsi and the Hutus, and I've no desire to be able to distinguish between the two. I believe the Tutsis are tall and the Hutus are small, and they've been butchering each other for 20 years. And that war does not interest me because I don't think I can make any real contribution. Covering it will not resolve it. But a larger conflict where important political issues are at stake, I want to be involved in that, whether it's the Israelis in Lebanon, the US in Central America, the Russians in Afghanistan, I covered that war several times, and the Gulf War, where decisions are being made, violence is perpetrated under the name of whatever, of national, imperialism or national honor or securing territory. That's where I want to be, because I think what flows from those acts of war affect international politics. So that's why I want to cover the big wars. The little ones, no.
You said in your introduction that you never wanted to be a participant, but always an observer. At the same time, though, you seem to be proud of the influence CNN, for example, is having on decision-making by politicians and military decision makers. Isn't there some sort of contradiction there?
Well, it is a different level of involvement, I think. I'm not so proud that CNN is being used. It's the phenomenon of it being used. It's the phenomenon of the communications has reached a point where it is convenient for decisions to be made, in a sense, or arguments to be delivered, openly. In the past, there'd be diplomatic dispatches conveyed from one government to another, and there are still plenty of secret negotiations. The Yasser Arafat and Rabin had their emissaries, I think, in some Scandinavian country for 9 months, I believe, thrashing out the recent agreements that will ultimately lead to some self-determination in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So that was all very secret. That the fact that more immediate issues can be made publicly by using CNN or other media is exciting to me, because the more public we have our debates, I think the better it is for all of us. I'm not a fan of secret diplomacy. Sometimes it has its place. Generally, though, secret diplomacy, it can also go nowhere.
Yeah, but what about these outbursts of public anger that television can cause? Douglas Hurd, for example, the British Minister of Foreign Affairs, has always argued against intervention in Bosnia, because he said, well, people will be appalled when they see images of carnage on TV, but they will never support a 3-month military involvement by Great Britain, and they will not support body bags returning to Great Britain either. Isn't what's actually what is with the outburst of public anger that your footage from Sarajevo, the carnage on the market, actually produces?
I look at Douglas Hurd and I look at Bill Clinton. I look at lack of leadership. We're democracies. We appoint leaders to lead us. Now, Douglas Hurd and Clinton too say, well, the public will be upset if we make these decisions. Britain lingered through the whole of the 1930s unwilling to confront Hitler, because people like Chamberlain were saying, we don't want to get involved with this guy. This will cost lives. And the lonely voice of Churchill saying, we're going to stop this menace. We're going to prevent this cancer across Europe, was not heard until finally the war was at Britain's doorstep. Then they had no choice but to fight. I am not saying that Bosnia is a parallel, but weak leadership is paralleled. Inert leadership, which Britain has. Britain doesn't have any decent political leadership today. And in foreign policy, I think President Clinton is lacking seriously. That is his greatest political weakness today is an inadequacy in foreign policy. So therefore, I would say that if Clinton was to lead, who knows where the country will go if he wants to lead in worthy causes. Now, I'd be the last to want to see body bags coming back from Bosnia with American bodies or any bodies in it. But at some point in time, you have to make the kind of decisions that gives countries respect and creates standards of decency and morality that we allegedly uphold in our great democratic traditions. And I don't think Douglas Hurd or, at the moment, Bill Clinton measure up to those standards, or other European leaders. That's not just what I feel, it's what many do feel, a weakness of leadership, and a weakness of leadership.
Is your reporting now more influential, since you've been working for TV, or for CNN specifically, than it was in the times of the Vietnam War when you were working for the Associated Press?
That is a good question. Influential. How do you measure influence? That is the issue. I think information, whether it's conveyed by television or print, is influential. Now, we talk about television because the images move and the blood runs wet. On the streets of Germiston the other day, we opened our story with blood running down a gutter in Germiston. And I said blood was literally running in the streets. That's a terrifying image. On the other hand, a news account in a newspaper can also be quite graphic. And don't forget the Watergate story that dethroned President Nixon, who died 3 days ago, was a newspaper story. Television really didn't get a handle on it. The Iran-Contra story in the United States, revealing the complicity of White House officials in skullduggery and illegal activities, was a newspaper story. So, I think that the print can still have a lot of impact. So can television. It's how do you measure it all? We're all related media, and certainly in television it's easier to get access to individuals. I spent 20 years with the Associated Press, and I'd visit Caribbean countries and couldn't even get an interview with the Prime Minister of Dominica, a country of 24,000 people. But if you've got a television camera, you can see presidents and officials anywhere in the world. So government officials seem to enjoy the television presentation of information, but print, I would argue, is extremely significant. And in fact, in Bosnia, the Pulitzer Prizes in successive years went to coverage from Bosnia for American media. So I think print is still very impactful.
Could you yourself imagine returning to print?
I did so in producing a book of 483 pages. Yeah, that is print.
In your capacity as a reporter,
Yes, I have nothing. I'd be happy to. I have nothing wrong with print. My daughter is a print journalist. My fiance is a print journalist, and I could see it. That doesn't pay as well.
You still seem to be proud of some of your better leads that you actually reprinted the book.
Yes. But see, I look at print and television journalism as being very similar. You were right in your remarks when you said that it wasn't easy for me to get adjusted to television. And what I said in the book was, and live coverage was difficult, because in live coverage where you got to stand up there and talk about an incident or to respond to questions, and I could never get used to talking before I could think, Talking before I thought is not easy to do, which is what live coverage is. And it is still not easy for me to do that, because I think I sound vaguely stupid sometimes. On the other hand, it is part of the environment of television. You go live to a location and someone is talking, so the audience is looking and they're saying, gee, that guy is in Baghdad, there's missiles flying around. And so it's part of the whole presentation. It's sort of, in that sense, showbiz in a way. It's just part of the, it's interesting and amusing, but it's not really calculated to directly impact. I think we got to realize that, CNN, BBC, your own newspaper, we aren't governments. We aren't political decision makers. We have no authority other than to be influential in idea presentation, but we don't sign off on any legislation. We can't order bureaucrats into action. We can't make any decisions, and we don't. We try to persuade. Or if we have persuasive information, but in the end, it's not us who commit countries to action. It's governments, elected officials. But we can be persuasive. But there is a huge gap between public interests really and government response, isn't it? How long, people's feelings, how do you measure them? And I think an interesting point about CNN is that we are in all governments. All foreign ministries have CNN. And I spent the day with Margaret Tutwiler recently, and she was James Baker's press secretary when James Baker was Secretary of State in the Bush administration. And she said that when she was giving her daily briefings at the State Department, and she had an altercation with Shamir in Israel or the early days of the Gulf War with Saddam Hussein or others, when she looked into the CNN camera, she felt she was talking directly to the chief of state who was causing the anger of the United States that day. She was giving a message to Saddam Hussein or whoever. And that's what she was looking and saying, listen, you guy, this is how we feel, knowing that the CNN would turn the tape around and that this individual out there somewhere in the foreign ministry would look at it and say, gee, she's talking to me. She intended that way. And it was interesting when that Baker, when he was in office, that's when CNN was really emerging after the Gulf War. And he was saying when he came back to a press conference one day that when he'd traveled to Central Asia after the fall of the Soviet Union and you had half a dozen new states, the first question he always got was, how do we get CNN? And why did they want CNN? They wanted to be part of the world decision-making body. They felt that this was a way to do it, and they wanted to get around the dominance of Moscow for information. Just one other point about CNN, just I remember it's Steven Spielberg, who directed the movie, of course, Schindler's List, of enormous impact. When he was in Tel Aviv a few weeks ago, in describing the making of that movie, he said, "I wanted to look at the Holocaust as though I was a CNN cameraman covering that event." So I thought that was interesting when CNN was getting into that cultural level.
What?
You made the switch from written press to television. Could you talk about the influence of audience ratings on your quest for truth and the influence of audience ratings on the conveyance of truth?
Fortunately, CNN doesn't have any ratings, literally, so it doesn't matter. In our case, we're like newspapers in the financing of CNN. We get everyone who takes cable in the United States, and most people around the world, pay us a monthly subscription to CNN, whether it's 90 cents of their cable bill or $1.20. So we have 50 million subscribers in the United States and 70 million internationally, or maybe 80 million. So we have 130 million people paying $1 a month for our service. So that's the first level of income. And secondly, we have advertisers who contribute more. Our ratings vary from, 1 million people watching to 3 million to 2. We aren't governed by ratings at all. So we are fortunately not in the position of ratings. What we have is credibility. We appeal to an upscale audience, and that's how we get our financing. So we don't have to have pretty faces on CNN. That's why I'm still working for them. Yep. And we don't have big stars on CNN. The news is the star. From the beginning, CNN management said the news is the star on CNN. And that remains the case. And we have an influence far greater than our audiences. Because every newspaper in the United States has CNN in its newsroom. Every government department has it. Every senator and congressman has CNN on. Big businesses have it, and internationally all foreign ministers have it, big hotels have it, so we appeal to an audience, an upscale audience, and that's where our influence comes in. We do not have popular appeal.
The advertisers advertise because of that availability of it and not because of ratings going up and down.
Yeah, that's right. They're looking at the audience we're reaching, and that's why they're advertising. That's why we don't have that much advertising. But thank goodness we are not ratings governed.
One of the things CNN does, of course, is that it confronts the general public with breaking news stories. I mean, the events 30 seconds after it happened gets on CNN. Well, the written press, AP, for example, does this in the form of bulletins and news alerts and urgent, but they are not available to a general public except for certain radio stations, perhaps. They are there to alert a newspaper staff that will later on turn the thing into some sort of sensible story. CNN, however, confronts people with a chain of events, true or not, because very often those news alerts, as we know, turn out to be not completely accurate or only half accurate, etc. I guess the criticism you could have against CNN, and Mort Rosenblum does this, for example, in his Who Stole the News, is that it confronts the public with some sort of entertaining chain of events, but it does not lead to any sort of understanding on why things are happening in a given situation, in a given conflict. Do you agree to that?
We leave that to newspapers such as yours to explain that. Let me give you an example. In the Gulf War, our ratings got very high. Our ratings were big in the Gulf War. They were 15 to 20%. Millions were looking at CNN. But at the same time, newspaper circulations all over the world increased. I think the New York Times went up 20%, Washington Post, because the issues raised in the television coverage were so interesting that people went to the newspapers to learn more. And what I have found is that when you have an event like the attempted coup in Moscow, when CNN, all day CNN had pictures of shells smashing into the Russian White House, and our reporters weren't particularly articulate about what was going on. But the spectacle of those shells crashing into a prominent building in downtown Moscow was enormously interesting, entertaining if you like. And of course, and people watching it, they went immediately to the morning paper to find out what the hell it was all about. But you could not leave the television scene. You were seeing history in motion. It was like, having a camera crew in Moscow and Lenin took over, and Lenin and St. Petersburg when Lenin took over power. I mean, I don't apologize for the entertainment value of CNN. I think news is tremendously entertaining. I think what happens in the world is one of the reasons I continue covering the world. I'm excited when I go to places like South Africa and meet Buthelezi or go out to some white community that's putting up fences around the road because they don't want the blacks to vote, or to have the joy of a Nelson Mandela meeting his thousands of followers. I mean, it's so thrilling. Why shouldn't the audience get a thrill? And I'll just give one other example. When the US Marines landed in Somalia in December of '92, we covered it live. I mean, with infrared cameras. And these Marines were coming across, their landing ships landing on the beach and coming in. It became laughable, however, because there were many journalists there, and the beach was crowded with reporters with lights and cameras. But if it hadn't been for that, the spectacle that CNN had initially of all these Marines landing and going through the countryside and arresting people, that was really spectacular. I mean, that's how it happens. And you could sit at home and have a drink and say, gee, look at that. And then the explanation would come. See, the interrelationship of all media is really important to me. I mean, television cannot do it alone. We need the newspapers and the magazines and books to further explain it. But television does, the technology dictates that television, we cannot turn the clock back. We aren't going to stop live coverage. It is here to stay. It's like stopping the telex machine, in the late 19th century. You cannot stop progress. You cannot stop the satellite telephone. We are here to stay. We're going to go live. We're going to get used to it and understand that is the nature of what communications are going to be. But to me, it makes a greater role for the print and magazines and newspapers to analyze what you see on television. And because I think it excites public interest in developments, whether local, political, regional, or international, it excites their interest. They're looking for more information. Mm-hmm. I mean, the more we go live, there'll be more work for all of us, right? And how many here want to work in journalism? But I really feel that we are enhancing and spicing up news and information, and I think we're creating more interest in it. And I have no apologies for that.
Isn't this tragic that you make a comedy from a tragedy?
Why don't you come and tell me I can't hear you.
Isn't it? Sorry.
Isn't it tragic to make a comedy from a tragedy? That's what you do then. That's what you just... I don't
think the elections in South Africa are a tragedy at all. I think they're a wonderful, positive development.
Somalia...
The lady refers to the example you gave of the American Marines landing on the beach, and there being more reporters to witness their secret landing than there actually were. There are different situations, of course, where, for example, people get wounded or killed. There are so many camera crews around that the whole thing gets sort of revolting. Do you ever feel some sort of remorse about your presence?
No, well, not one cameraman died on that Somalia landing. The CNN was there. We were invited by the U.S. Embassy. We were invited by the U.S. Embassy to go to the beach and cover it. It was very simply, we went to the beach and covered it. It was not a secret landing. That was a well-publicized landing. The Marines always land that way. Even on maneuvers in California, they land at 4 in the morning. To that degree, though, and it was really a positive event because the Marines were coming in to reinforce the whole humanitarian effort.
But in other situations where people actually get wounded?
You mean journalists?
No, victims, participants in a conflict, for example. Let's say you have people wounded in after a shell has landed at a certain spot. Civilians get wounded. Then, too, sometimes you have more reporters or more camera crews even than and victims, do you?
Yeah, but so what?
How do you deal with that?
What do you mean? I mean, when you look at the death toll on a daily basis in this world, right now, Rwanda, they're talking about 150,000 people dead. We've seen a few dead. We haven't seen anything like 150. I saw a picture from Reuters the other day of maybe 200 people, bodies. I saw 2 weeks ago some people being hacked to death. So of all the 150,000 who have died, you may have seen the image of one person dying and 100 bodies. You take all the images on television any 1 year of death and destruction, and that may be 0.03 of the real death and destruction. Of the 200,000 who died in Bosnia, we haven't got much of a record of that. And I assure you, and in the Vietnam War, where 2 million people died, with this one picture of one execution in the streets of Saigon, the police chief blows out the brains of a Viet Cong. But 2 million people died. So, the small amount of cruelty that we show on television is a tiny representation of what's happening. I would want more cruelty on television because we just close our ears to what's going on around and the bloodshed and the cruelty of this world. And if you're shocked at what you're seeing, you're not even seeing a tiny percentage on television of what the reality of the world is. And I would have live cameras everywhere if I could. Because we only by knowing what's going on are we going to do something to stop it. Because I think we could do more to stop it. But so I have no apologies for what little we put on the air at all. And the fact that in some occasions there's more cameramen than victims, some stories are bigger than others. It depends on where these circumstances happen.
Mr. Arnett, you just told us that you prefer a major conflict to be a reporter there instead of being a reporter at a battle between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And you just acknowledged in your several answers that you're a political factor and sometimes a major factor. What's your opinion about being a political factor without being elected?
Without being elected. In effect, we are elected. We're elected by a public in a free market that has the choice of buying our service or not, of turning us off or turning us on. A lot of news organizations have collapsed in the last 20 or 30 years. Newspapers rise and fall. Television organizations rise and fall. We are elected by viewers who decide whether or not they want to look at us. We're elected in effect by the free market. We aren't self-appointed purveyors of our own viewpoints. I mean, we're out there competing with everyone else, and we could be knocked off the television screens by collapsing economies. I mean, it's a miracle that CNN is even around today because it's a miracle we're making a profit, really. And that at any time up to 5 years ago, we could have closed down. I mean, quite a few organizations like CNN, they've attempted to. The European Community has one right now, I believe, a television, try to be a an inter-European television, news program. It'll probably die because it just doesn't have popular support. So I mean, we are elected in that sense.
Don't you think that you're elected because you show some spectacles instead of that you're being elected because of your political views?
No, I don't. We don't show much. As I was saying, we don't show much spectacle because, in truth, if you look at CNN over a course of a day, you don't really see much that's spectacular. You see basically a lot of boring press conferences, a lot of politicians who are, industrialists, businessmen. It's only, how often do you see live coverage of the Russian White House being shelled? Very rarely. I mean, when you look at it, it's basically routine coverage, and I don't think, and as we said earlier, I don't think we don't have policy-making powers. We don't have regulatory powers. We are simply out there with information like newspapers have for 100 years. I mean, I just don't see how we have any particular authority that anyone else has.
Mr. Arnett, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a diplomat, but I'm a doctor. I worked for 10 years in these areas where you worked as well, and very often I was confronted with reporters who were actually more in the way than they did something useful. And I very often thought of myself the same way as well. And I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I think the average journalist should try to be at least slightly more modest about his work or her work in those areas, because as you said yourself, you don't even know what the impact of all the things you're doing over there is. And the second thing is, this is just a remark, and a question is, when I was in northern Iraq, and I showed some data that we collected via the American government on the Kurdish situation, I was told by CNN reporters that they were not interested in data that were actually very nicely collected and just in images, because that was not their role. So do you only see your role in creating images and selling images, or is there more behind it? It's not a new question, but it keeps up bubbling with me.
You have a valid point. If you talk to a CNN reporter and he was disinterested in what you said, I'm just sorry that he felt that way. But in fact, you know, the reporters in humanitarian organizations such as yours, doctors, aid workers, we're like that when we cover wars. And for example, in Bosnia, my brief visit, it was the UN HCR, High Commission for Refugees, that got us in and out of Mostar on one occasion. They said, you know, we'll let you in, you know, and they took us in for a reason. They wanted us to talk to people and get those images out. And in doctors and hospitals I've been to have helped us. Sure, we get in the way. It's true. We, you know, the press flounder around, and we're not expert in some of these crisis areas, and we tend to be nervous, and we tend to be inconsiderate, and you know, but we are there in one way or another. It's not easy to get reporters it's not easy to get doctors and medical people and personnel such as yourself to go to these areas. Let's face it, there are limited numbers, and as it is with news media, but I can't, you know, I just can't explain why maybe.
You just said that photojournalists are lining up for the thrill, isn't it?
I didn't say that. I didn't say photojournalists were lining up for the thrill. I didn't. To the contrary, there are not that many. I mean, I said there's plenty of work in journalism. I'm not saying that many journalists want to go to Sarajevo. They don't. And I'm not saying that many journalists want to go and cover wars. They don't. In fact, my book talks about Baghdad, where 90% left when the bombing started. Now, there aren't that many lining up to go to where the action is. There are a lot want work in journalism.
The ones that left Baghdad, did they fail in their?
No, I don't. I don't think it's your own. It's a call. I mean, I don't think for a moment look at bravery as being a major factor. You know, I was in last week in Tokosa, where in Tokosa Township near Johannesburg, where a Johannesburg star photographer had been killed the previous day. And when I got there were 20 photographers, many of whom I knew, sitting around. They didn't have flak vests, and they were waiting for the action. And action started. They were right with the frontline troops. I didn't go with them. I thought, you know, you can get killed out there. So I make decisions every day in these actions about not going the full way, and I have no quarrel with those who left Baghdad at all. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't quarrel with that. I mean, it's up to them to make the decision to do it.
What is it then that makes you stay while everybody else leaves?
Well, in that case, it was the best story in the world. It was a unique moment for journalism. That's why I stayed there.
Fair answer. Next question.
Mr. Arnett, former President Nixon was highly esteemed by foreign countries, yet he resigned the presidency in disgrace. What is your feeling about all of the hoopla concerning his death, where people had the day off to memorialize him, and there were so many stories concerning him in the paper, on television? What is your feeling about all of that?
Well, I have two feelings. One as a journalist, where I have to react to the, you know, and I haven't been in the States, but react to the outpouring, and it was absolutely true that President Clinton and many others, President Carter, eulogized him, that crowds began gathering at his It is home and its community in Southern California, and that praise came from the most unexpected quarters. So at one level, I mean, the story is that many America decided to mourn him, and they felt passionately about his death, and that it was sort of a vindication. You know, it's an awful vindication. I have to die to be vindicated. Now that's the professional. Personally, you know, I think he was kicked out of the presidency for good reason. And even though he did have expertise in foreign policy, I interviewed him several times. In fact, I met him in Vietnam on 2 occasions in the mid-60s when he was traveling for Pepsi Cola before he became president. And I did interview him afterwards a couple of times after the presidency. As far as I was concerned, I was on his enemies list number 2, not on the primary enemies list, but on the secondary enemies list, because he didn't like our Vietnam reporting. And personally, I just think in many ways he's being overrated, but then America's a very sentimental country. And he is the first president to die in 21 years, and I think the symbolism is very important. But I don't want to trip, but the symbolism is very important to Americans. And in fact, in Johannesburg, I was talking to my American colleagues, and they pointed that out. They said, you know, we revere the presidency, the office. And a president dies, and it's a little bit of America. The other factor is that Nixon did span 40 years of American political life. He came to represent so much of what American politics was all about, and I think there's a lot of nostalgia involved in that.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Mr. Arnett, as you know, all over Europe, and including here in Holland, the American bases are closing. They're going home. And I wonder if you would care to give an opinion about that, whether you think they should have gone long ago or they should stay around a little longer? Or?
Good question. It is part of the central debate in the United States. It's about the defense cuts. It's America's posture as a world power. I think that Bill Clinton is not addressing it adequately. I think, you know, I'm not an anti-Clintonite. I've been criticizing his foreign policy, but I don't think he's come to terms with the issue of America's foreign policy role in the future, America's role as a superpower, the only one left.
Should he send troops to Bosnia, by the way? Should he send troops to Bosnia? American troops to Bosnia?
You know, that's up to him. I don't think the American public is interested in getting involved in Bosnia, but if there was stronger leadership, maybe, certainly the Republican minority talks about going to Bosnia in one way, shape, or form. Bob Dole has talked about it. I think Bosnia is becoming a big political issue. It is a question in the United States of Clinton's credibility as a foreign policy president. He is unsteady. The Republicans are boring in and criticizing him openly now for not doing anything about Bosnia. They want America to allow arms to be sold to the Muslims. They want airstrikes. And he is suffering from that. In terms of, I don't think anyone is speaking about putting American troops in, but they're talking about everything but. But in terms of the bases again, the U.S. is floundering to some degree in its position. The American public seems to think the peace dividend means more money for the war on poverty and less for defense. But I think it's still a very much debatable issue, and a new president, I mean, if Clinton fails in the next election, he'll be beaten by a hawkish Republican. There's no doubt about it that if he is a one-term president, there'll be a hawkish Republican coming in, and who knows what a hawkish Republican will do on the bases issue, on the defense issue. I wish I was clearer on this, but it's still a evolving situation now.
Thank you.
One shortly over here, and then I'm afraid we'll have to call it a day.
Yeah, they're giving me a rough time here. I think the sooner the better. I get out of here.
Mr. Arnett, usually when the American military is involved in an international conflict, they send their own military journalists and media to the site of conflict also. What has been your working relationship with them?
We could talk about that a long time. We've got to go look at a little bit of history here, that when I went to Vietnam with David Halbertson and Neil Sheehan and all these young guys 30 years ago, the tradition of the previous few generations had been that the American media worked hand in glove with the US military. The American media were patriotic, nationalistic, and always checked with the American embassy before filing their dispatches. Well, within a year or so, we couldn't get into the American embassy in Saigon. They didn't want to see us. And we filed our dispatches independently. Military men in Vietnam did not understand. They looked with disfavor upon the media. They couldn't understand why we didn't get behind the war. And in fact, after the war, blamed the media for losing it for years. The right wing blamed the media for losing it. Now, contemporary historians say that is rubbish because the contemporary historians know it was the decision-making of the Johnson administration, the inadequacies of the policies that failed. The problem is that since Vietnam, our relations with the military are extremely negative, that we do not trust them to take us on assignments, and it has been described recently as the worst standoff between the American media and the American military in history.
What can be done to make it better?
Yeah, what can be done to make it? If the next war was a super patriotic war, the only way to get us together is if Mars invades, then we'll, but I hate to be trivial. I think it's going to be a learning experience. I think that, you know, the media, we've got so much technology now, we've told the Pentagon we're going to cover the next war, whether they like it or not. In Somalia, for example, it wasn't even American journalists who took those pictures of the atrocities against the Americans. It was a Canadian in the Somalia. But they got onto the American media very quickly. So the Pentagon can't control things anymore. In Somalia, they didn't want American journalists with the Rangers. But in the end, the Rangers were covered. So we're trying to convince the Pentagon that they should cooperate with us. Let us out on these operations. Let us give their viewpoint and side of the story. And we'll get along fine. But it is very difficult. It is a standoff. And they just don't trust us. And I think they're scared of the potential of what media can do. But, you know, that comes with the territory today with communications developed the way they are.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. We'll have to round up, but Anna Wethen will do that for us.
Gentlemen, people have to catch trains, and so we have to come to a close to this very interesting discussion.
No, it's a pity.
Thank you, Mr. Arnett, and thank you, Raymond van der Boogaard. We couldn't have had a better opening for our new series, American Focus. Thank you again. Thank you, Raymond. You had the difficult task of moderator, but you handled your commitment with grace and excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, it might interest you, next year David Halbertson will be in our program. The next lecture will feature an American painter. The information is in the hall. And for the closing of our season, literary season, will be Art Spiegelman in conversation with Joost Zwarte. Okay, thank you.